Globalization has failed the West and the United States of America. It's a failed policy.
This was said at a recent World Economic Forum meeting, and it pretty much captures the shift in how people are starting to think about globalization. The original idea was simple. Countries specialize, produce goods where it's cheapest, and trade freely. And overall, that was supposed to benefit everyone. But now, you're seeing more and more countries moving away from that because they want control over their own supply lines and they want to bring production closer to home. And when you hear what's going on right now, it starts to sound like globalization is starting to fall apart. But in reality, it's not. Because in 2025, global trade actually hit a record $35 trillion. Goods are traveling farther than ever before, and by most measures, globalization is actually at an all-time high. So something different is happening here, because globalization isn't ending, but it is starting to reorganize. The forces pushing against the old version of globalization are real, and they actually have their reasons for why they want things to be different. When COVID hit, it exposed how fragile global supply chains actually were. When one port shut down in China, and you started to see factories shut down in the US or leave hospitals without basic equipment, companies realized they had optimized too far for cost and not enough for resilience. Then geopolitics made it worse. The US-China trade war didn't just stay about tariffs, it started turning into real economic separation. With trade between the two dropping significantly and entire industries like semiconductors and AI moving towards almost complete decoupling. At the same time, global conflicts started disrupting key resources. The war in Ukraine affected energy and food supplies, countries began restricting exports, and rising tensions in places like the Middle East reminded everyone that critical shipping routes aren't guaranteed. And when governments see that kind of risk, they respond by trying to control it, with more tariffs, tighter export controls, and more scrutiny on foreign investment. Trade stopped being just about economics, and it started becoming about national security. And companies followed that shift. A huge percentage of manufacturers have already started moving parts of their supply chains out of China and are planning to bring production closer to home or at least keep it within the same region. So this shift towards shorter supply chains, more control, and less dependence, it's real and it's happening, but it's only half the story. Because while the political narrative makes it sound like everything is breaking apart, the actual data tells a completely different story. If you look at 2025, for example, global trade didn't shrink, it grew. In fact, it hit a record $35 trillion, with strong growth not just in developed economies, but across emerging markets as well. Trade between developing countries is increasing, new industries like AI are driving a huge share of global trade growth, and overall activity is still expanding despite all the tariffs and tensions. And when researchers looked at the structure of trade itself, they found something even more surprising. Goods aren't traveling shorter distances, they're actually traveling farther than ever. So there's no real evidence that the world is suddenly trading locally or pulling into tight regional areas. If anything, countries are still reaching outward, just in different directions. And part of the reason this keeps happening is simple. The US, while important, is only a portion of the global economy. So when it puts up trade barriers and reduces trade, the rest of the world doesn't stop trading, it adjusts. Countries try to find new partners, new routes, and new markets. And that keeps global trade growing. So globalization isn't dying, and it's not really continuing in its old form either. So then what's actually happening? The best way to describe it is reglobalization. Trade networks aren't being destroyed, they're being reorganized. Some links are breaking, like direct US-China trade in certain industries, but at the same time, new ones are forming. We can see it happening right in front of us. Take Mexico, for example. It's now America's largest trading partner. And on the surface, it looks like companies are just moving production out of China and bringing it closer to home. But if you look one layer deeper, Mexico's imports from China have actually been increasing, and Chinese companies are building factories there at record levels. And China is essentially white labeling its exports through Mexico to bypass US tariffs. So what looks like reshoring is often just rerouting. Vietnam tells a very similar story. Its exports to the US have exploded over the past decade, but at the same time, its dependence on Chinese imports has grown even faster. It's essentially plugged into China's supply chain, importing components, assembling them, and then exporting finished goods to the US. And when economists started looking at where products actually come from across the full supply chain, not just the last country they're shipped from, they found something even more surprising. The US didn't really diversify from China, it diversified away from its own allies while still staying deeply connected to Chinese production through these intermediary companies. And China hasn't pulled back either. If anything, it's globalized even more, investing heavily in manufacturing across other regions and rerouting its exports through different channels. So the world isn't stepping away from production in China, it's kind of building around it. And what's starting to emerge is a different kind of global system, one that's organized less around cost and more about geopolitical alignment. Countries are trading more with allies and less with rivals, and investment is starting to follow that same pattern. You're seeing more regional trade agreements, more cooperation within blocs, and more trade happening between developing economies themselves. But the easiest way to understand this shift is to zoom out. The old model of globalization, especially from the early 2000s up until recently, was built around one main idea: cost. You make everything wherever it's cheapest, ship it wherever it's needed, and let efficiency drive the system. That's what built the modern global economy. But it also created a system that was extremely fragile, where one disruption, a pandemic, or a war, or a political decision could shut down entire industries. So the new model is optimizing for something different, not just efficiency, but resilience. Instead of relying on one country, companies are trying to spread production across multiple regions, even if it costs more. So instead of one factory in China, it's China, Vietnam, Mexico, maybe India. It's more expensive, it's more complex, and it's harder to manage, but it's less likely to break if something goes wrong. At the same time, this shift comes with a real cost. When companies move production or build backup suppliers and hold more inventory to avoid disruptions, everything becomes more expensive because it costs more to produce, more to manage, and more to maintain. And those costs don't just disappear. They get passed on to the consumer. So even if you don't see it directly, it shows up in the price of what you buy. That's the trade-off: a more resilient system, but a more expensive one for the customer. The real risk here isn't that globalization disappears, it's that it fragments. Right now, we're leaning on connector economies like Mexico, Vietnam, and India to try to bridge the gap on production and try to get away from our dependence on China. But they don't have the decades of infrastructure that China built. We're essentially trade testing a brand new system in real time. So we end up in this dead zone, a system that's more expensive than the old one, but not yet strong enough to be reliable. And if that gap gets too wide, we won't really get the resilience we were promised, just a more fragile, more expensive version of the world we already had.